Following the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression would cause financial turmoil for people all across the developed world. Prices were soaring, unemployment was up, and many families struggled just to put food on the table. In their desperation, those living in countries most affected by this event would have to adapt to new ways of eating in order to survive. The 1930s would bring a wave of creative recipes and methods for reducing, replacing, and reusing any food that was available. And because food meant survival, some of the things that could be found on the Depression-era dinner table were very, very weird. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Historodame, and today, we're discussing weird foods from the Great Depression. With unemployment high and money tight, families were limited with what kind of food they had access to. The main priority was feeding yourself with as many calories as you could get, not necessarily to make the most appetizing meal. Many recipes from the time came from necessity, using cheap staples, easily foraged ingredients, and whatever people could grow in their home gardens. Items like meat, eggs, or dairy suddenly became expensive luxuries, which meant that people had to make do with ingredients that they might not have been used to using, resulting in some, let's say, interesting combinations. Take, for instance, peanut butter stuffed onions. These were two items that were easily accessible to many people, since onions could be grown in a home garden and peanut butter was a cheap and easy source of protein. In the United States, this recipe was actually promoted by the Bureau of Home Economics due to the high nutritional value of the ingredients and the simplicity of the dish. It called for stuffing an onion with a mixture of peanut butter and breadcrumbs, and then baking it at a low heat. I imagine that the finished dish came with a flavor that can only be described as waging war on your taste buds. Sandwiches were another item that could make a quick and easy meal. But with many common fillings inaccessible for most families, some improvising would need to be done. People began making sandwiches out of anything that they had left over. There were onion sandwiches, sandwiches made from potato peels, tomato sandwiches, and cucumber sandwiches. Other people turned to condiments, inventing the mayonnaise or ketchup sandwich, and some brave souls just used lard or leftover bacon grease. And while these simple options range from slightly unusual to stomach-churning, the combination sandwiches were arguably worse. The peanut butter and pickle sandwich is one such example that was likely as horrifying as it sounds. There was also peanut butter and mayonnaise, or the bean sandwich, where you put canned beans on top of bread with a bit of processed cheese and bacon, before broiling it in the oven to make some kind of sick mockery of an English breakfast. But amidst all this culinary madness, there were two classic sandwiches that were untainted by the struggles of the Depression, that being the standard peanut butter sandwich, and the Kraft single grilled cheese. And even though Kraft singles can barely be considered cheese, they must have remained a beacon of hope in these trying times. Meat was particularly hard to come by during the Great Depression. Its high prices made it a luxury that not every family could afford, meaning that in order to get sufficient protein, some substitutions had to be made. Cheaper cuts of meat, like liver, tails, and tongue, soared in popularity, and many families were forced to adapt to these new limited options. Take pickled tongue, for example, a recipe which called for one pork, beef, or deer tongue to be boiled until tender, sliced into thin pieces, and then put into canning jars with sliced onions, vinegar, water, and spices. Another recipe that was meat-adjacent was blood sausages, which only required fresh blood to be cooked and then mixed with fillers like bread, cornmeal, onion, and barley. Recipes like meatloaf became a staple of Depression-era households. This allowed meat products to be stretched much further by adding filler ingredients like grains, nuts, or legumes, and was also an easy way to use up leftovers. A dish like meat scrapple was another way to use small amounts of meat from other recipes. This called for leftover scraps to be added to a pot, covered with water and seasoned. Once it began to boil, it would then be thickened with cornmeal until it had a mushy consistency, before being poured into a loaf pan and chilled. This would then be sliced, fried, and served with breakfast. More adventurous cooks who wanted access to meat might have also used less conventional animals. Those who were able to hunt could have turned to turtles, skunks, squirrels, or possums. And in some cases, the desperate would even turn to roadkill in order to put food on the table. For those who didn't have access to meat at all, meat replacements would have to be their primary source of protein. Beans were a great option, since they were relatively cheap and could be canned or even grown yourself. And of course, who could forget the most infamous meat replacement that was floating around during this era? Gelatin. There comes a time in every person's life where the burden of cooking dinner just becomes too much to bear, and they say, screw it, just put everything into a pot. The Great Depression had an entire genre of recipes that worked this way. Whether it be a soup, casserole, or gelatin abomination, when times were tough, struggling cooks just chucked whatever they had into one dish and called it dinner. With the introduction of lime-flavored JellO in the 1930s, dishes that used gelatin were more popular than ever. Not only was it a cheap source of protein, and a way to use up leftover ingredients, but the lime flavor was versatile enough that it could be used in both sweet and savory dishes, like the horrifying perfection salad, a dish that really stretches the definition of both perfection and salad. This called for 1 packet of lemon or lime JellO, vinegar, celery, cabbage, peppers, and onions. These ingredients should be stirred together and then poured into a mold and chilled until your Frankenstein creation was ready to serve. Some less horrifying ways to use up extra ingredients included the many casseroles and soups that became a symbol of Depression-era cuisine. One dish that was literally called leftover casserole required 1 cup of each: leftover meat, rice, peas or beans, whole tomatoes, and finally 4 potatoes, 1 onion, and 2 carrots. Another dish that used up leftovers was spaghetti and carrot casserole, which pretty much just combined pasta, carrots, and white sauce into a brick. There was also bologna casserole, which had an ingredient list that was made up entirely of canned foods. Soups were arguably more familiar territory, with classics like split pea soup and tomato soup eaten in households all across North America. But there were also stranger combinations, like Hoover stew, which was named after the American president Hubert Hoover, and combined a mix of Kraft mac and cheese, hot dogs, tomatoes, peas, and corn. The meal that really embodies the Great Depression, however, is the aptly named Depression soup, whose recipe literally amounts to throw anything that you have into a pot and make it work. Now, of course, no fine meal is really complete without a nice dessert, and people in the 1930s thought the very same way. But this is also where they would have run into a roadblock, because a lot of desserts call for eggs, milk, or butter, with most using at least one of the 3. With these items being so expensive, however, people had to learn how to experiment without them. Wacky cake was one of these milkless, eggless, and butterless recipes that improvised a chocolate cake using things like oil and vinegar, and it still turned out surprisingly good. But while there were some cakes that managed to make it work, pie was a different story. What do you do when half the ingredients in your recipe are unavailable, including the fruit? Well, you start to turn to unorthodox fillings. Vinegar cobbler was the answer that some people came up with. If you managed to get your hands on some butter, then you could make a pie crust and create a filling using vinegar, sugar, vanilla, butter, and water. Now, as a vinegar hater myself, I don't want this wretched condiment anywhere near my dessert, but apparently it worked pretty well. Vinegar cobbler had a consistency like a custard pie, and it came with a nice sweet and tart flavor. But what do you do when you don't even have vinegar and you're craving pie? Well, the king of bare bones recipes was the water pie, and it pretty much included everything from the previous recipe without the vinegar. Who would have guessed that something as simple as hot water could be a pie filling? And finally, we have what is, in my opinion, the most iconic dessert to come out of the Great Depression: the mock apple pie. That's right, it's an apple pie without any apples. How do you make an apple pie without apples? Surprisingly, you use Ritz crackers. When you crush the crackers and soak them in water, lemon juice, and apple pie spices, they develop a consistency and flavor that is freakishly similar to regular apple pie. And guys, I've actually had this one, and I don't know what kind of magic is involved, but it actually tastes like apple pie. It is insane. If you're brave enough to try any of these recipes, I highly recommend that it be this one. And there you have it, those are some of the weird things that people ate to survive during the Great Depression. Sure, they might be a little weird to our modern taste buds, but these recipes were a symbol of human perseverance and creativity, and I think that's part of their charm. So the next time you're looking for a vintage recipe, maybe consider giving one of these a try. Hey everyone, thank you for watching! If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or a comment down below. If you want to see more content like this, you can also subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date on all the fun history videos of the future. But for now, I bid you farewell.